But it's this outsider status and his rough-and-tumble street mentality which will ultimately prove to be his downfall. But for now, the carnage continues, as the bodies of gangland foot soldiers continue to pile up in the streets. Failing to get at the Mad Dog himself, Dutch strikes a lethal blow by rubbing out his beloved brother Peter.
Vincent took his brother's passing very bad, and he told a couple of gunmen that were with him that day, "When I grab that Dutchman, I wish I had him in my hands now. I'm going to rip his eye out of his head and eat it." That's exactly the type of personality we're talking about.
By now, the Schultz-Cole War is raging out of control. Now it is personal. A no-holds-barred bloodfest. Dutch puts a $50,000 bounty on Mad Dog's head. On the night of February 1st, 1932, a group of Schultz triggermen decimate one of Cole's suspected hideouts on Commonwealth Avenue, leaving 4 of his men dead, but not catching the elusive Cole himself.
Commonwealth Avenue massacre was a major warning to Vincent Cole that he was highly vulnerable. He chose to disregard the warning.
After the Commonwealth Avenue affair, Cole knows his days are numbered. Most of his troops have been killed, he is starved for cash, and he is being hunted by Dutch Schultz. On the morning of February 8th, not a week after the massacre, Vincent emerges briefly from hiding, just long enough to make a phone call.
This vicious war that took about 40 lives on both sides, right, ended in a telephone booth.
Shortly after Vince pumps a couple of coins into the phone, one of Schultz's gunmen, probably Bo Weinberg, pumps 15 lead slugs into Cole's body, shattering the glass of the phone booth, but miraculously not even touching the wood frame. When Vincent Cole takes his last breath, there's no doubt that Dutch Schultz breathes a big sigh of relief. He's eliminated one of his biggest problems, yet bigger problems loom ahead. Prohibition with all its glorious riches is coming to an end, and all the rules are changing. The top figures of organized crime are coming together to form a national crime syndicate. Bugsy Siegel, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, Lepke Buchalter, and Lucky Luciano. Yet Dutch Schultz is not invited to this new syndicate and remains an outsider.
To invite him in meant running risks for themselves. Dutch Schultz had a capacity for being in the news all the time. And that's very unhealthy for organized crime. They don't like that.
Dutch develops an uneasy relationship with the new syndicate, but remains an outsider. For now, he's still the beer baron, but as repeal becomes imminent, his empire is vulnerable. If he is to survive, he needs to find a new racket. It's in the face of this looming crisis that Dutch will make the shrewdest move of his career. What is going through Dutch Schultz's mind as he deliriously rambles on his deathbed? Jagged reflections of a life in crime? Is he afraid? Does he feel any guilt for the lives he destroyed? Dutch is not a religious man. He was born Jewish, but had never practiced his faith. Yet he is about to receive a profound biblical message. As Dutch lay dying, a telegram is delivered to the hospital. It says simply, "As ye sow, so shall ye reap." Signed, Madam Queen of Policy. Madam Queen of Policy, also known as the Tiger from Marseille, is in fact Miss Stephanie St. Clair, a feisty female policy banker who was one of Dutch's victims in his hostile takeover of the Harlem numbers racket. But unlike her male counterparts, Madam Queen stands up to the Dutchman. She even has the audacity to go to the local police and complain about Dutch taking over her racket.
Mr. Schultz is trying to make trouble for me. But I set up a meeting with him next week. And it is then I will make my position clear. That she was able to dominate practically that whole numbers racket in Harlem, the only woman ever, and that Dutch Schultz was able to wipe out every other banker, and they were all male. He never touched her.
Madam Queen's bitterness is understandable, but for Schultz, the move into Harlem is also a matter of survival.
By 1931, anyone could see that the prohibition was going to be coming to an end. He looked around, saw that the policy field was ripe, and he went into it.
The numbers racket, or policy as it was called, is tremendously popular in Harlem for the simple reason that one can bet as little as a penny or a nickel. At odds of 600 to 1, even a penny paid $6, a month's worth of groceries in Depression-era Harlem. Organized crime tends to look down on policy as a nickel-and-dime racket. But Dutch sees an opportunity and begins a blitzkrieg through Harlem utilizing the same strong-arm tactics he had used in taking over the beer trade to take over the minority-owned policy banks and organize them into his own combination. Eventually, through Dutch's shrewd management, those nickels and dimes add up to a $20 million a year racket. There is only one minor problem with the policy racket. It is illegal, and constant busts and police raids are an occupational hazard. So Dutch acquires the legal skills of Dixie Davis, the best policy attorney in the city, to keep the revolving doors of justice spinning. Dixie becomes his personal attorney and advisor. He also helps Dutch make an important political connection by introducing him to Tammany Hall boss Jimmy Hines. They meet in a car on 6th Avenue in Chelsea, and before the ride is over, Hines is on Dutch's payroll to the tune of $500 a week, plus expenses.
Well, Harlem, of course, was Jimmy Hines' territory. That's where Jimmy Hines was the political boss. And with the support of Jimmy Hines, and Jimmy Hines' political connections with police and district attorneys and that, it kind of smoothed the transition for Dutch.
Well, most of the municipal judges were corrupt, and so a man like Hines, being as high up as he was in the Tammany organization, was enormously valuable to Dutch Schultz.
Although he is technically a politician, there is very little difference between the way Dutch runs his rackets and the way Hines runs his influence peddling racket. He is brutal, violent, and does much of his business on street corners outside of bars. A word from Hines can fix almost anything, from the courts to the police and everything in between. Dutch's empire is blossoming, and he has branched out into a number of different rackets. One of his most profitable is the restaurant union, in which restaurant owners are compelled to pay Dutch for protection. If the owners choose not to join the union, well then, they discover exactly what they need protection against.
A stink bomb would be thrown into their restaurant at the height of either lunch or dinner and make all the meal unpalatable for the guests.
As unpalatable as it may be, the restaurant owners join and pay dues to Dutch's Metropolitan Restaurant Workers Association, and the man in charge of running and collecting dues for this union is Julie Martin, who makes the fatal mistake of attempting to embezzle from the Dutchman.
Something very, very bad is going to happen, if you crossed him, really. Something really black will definitely happen to you.
Dutch confronts Julie and accuses him of stealing his money. Julie pleads and tries to explain. Dutch seems calm and reasonable, until suddenly he casually whips out his pistol.
Well, he just took the gun out and blasted the guy. No questions, no talk, no nothing. It was like drinking a cup of coffee. It was like nothing.
Dutch is questioned about Julie Martin's murder, but never indicted. He is above the law. He owns the law, at least for now. But things are changing. The public is sick of corruption rotting the city, and Mayor LaGuardia is elected, riding a sweeping tide of reform and vowing to clean up.
LaGuardia was a new voice and a different voice. I mean, he was tough and he was independent. He certainly made big changes in the city.
But LaGuardia isn't the only new candidate voted into office.
Jimmy Hines did get $30,000 from Dutch to support the election of a district attorney in New York County, that's Manhattan, in 1933. $30,000 would have been a pretty considerable sum at that time.
Dutch's candidate, William Copeland Dodge, is a patsy, completely ineffectual as district attorney. But then again, that's the idea. He continues to botch the job of fighting crime in the city until something extraordinary happens. The grand jury, ordinarily a rubber stamp committee, rebels against the district attorney, an unprecedented maneuver which sends a shockwave through New York City.
It was obvious that he was not doing his job. He was not pursuing the big criminals. The grand jury, for once, took matters into its own hands.
And it became what is known as a runaway grand jury. They ignored the district attorney and began their own investigation and issued their own report on organized crime here in New York City.
The runaway grand jury becomes a catalyst for public outrage at political corruption, and pressure is put on the governor to appoint a special prosecutor.
The pressure was so great that the governor then had to appoint someone who the public demanded, namely Thomas Dewey.
Thomas Dewey has already earned a reputation as an effective and fearless prosecutor by the age of 31. Talented, fierce, and incorruptible, he is the one man the underworld fears, and the public demands him.
Everybody said, this is the man for the job. He's got the legal skills, he's got the energy, the youth, the character, the fearlessness to go out and do the job that has to be done on the rackets here in New York City.
Dewey was a very, very formidable prosecutor. After Dewey came in, his goose was cooked. Everyone knew that once Dewey focused on him, as he was going to do, then he was finished.
In fact, Dewey is preparing to not only indict Dutch, but to make an example of him. He plans to employ the new techniques pioneered in the recent conviction of Al Capone.
Dewey utilized the method of going after famous gangsters, and the only way that they can get them, since they couldn't get them for any actual crime that they committed, but to get them on tax evasion.
On January 25, 1933, Dewey indicts the Dutchman on federal tax evasion charges, claiming that he'd made $481,637.35 over the last 3 years. Finally, Dutch finds himself in a mess that all of his money and power can't fix. Faced with the prospect of a long prison stay, Dutch Schultz does something startling. Dutch Schultz is in serious trouble. He's got that untouchable prosecutor Thomas Dewey on his back, and he's facing a federal rap for tax evasion. Faced with a situation he can't bribe or shoot his way out of, Dutch goes on the lam. For the next 22 months, Dutch goes underground and becomes one of the most wanted men in the country. In New York City alone, 50,000 wanted posters and 18,000 men in blue are out looking for Dutch Schultz. So where does Dutch find his sanctuary from this dreadful manhunt? Right at home in New York City.
With money, you could do a lot of things. If you're on the lam and you take care of people the right way financially, they're going to keep their mouths closed. They're not going to blow, a sugar cane.
He continued to go to nightclubs. He continued to live in New York City, and even though his wanted poster was up in all the post offices, he continued to evade capture for 22 months.
Dutch does maintain several hideouts around town and in the country, but one of his favorite hangouts during this fugitive period is Polly Adler's notorious House of Prostitution. It's ironic that although Dutch refuses to deal in the flesh trade, he certainly has no problem indulging in it.